Today we're going to look at probably one of the most controversial parts of Beatles history. Just before the Beatles were about to make their first record, they decided to replace Pete Best, the drummer who'd been with them for 2 years, with Ringo Starr. And there's been many stories, so many myths about what happened and why it happened. In my last book called Finding the Fourth Beatle, I really wanted to find out what really happened at the time. There's so many stories, reasons given, Pete wouldn't have the haircut, Pete never smiled, he wasn't like the rest of them. And of course the one that comes out a lot of the time was that Pete couldn't play drums. Well, that in itself is daft, because if you've been in a band, and I have, if you play with a bad drummer, you know very, very quickly they're a bad drummer and the group can't function. Pete played with the Beatles for 2 years. Live he actually played more hours than Ringo ever did, because those times you're playing 6 to 8 hours a night in Hamburg, that's when you become a great band. And John Lennon always said that the Beatles were at their best when they were wearing their black leathers in Liverpool and Hamburg, which was when they were with Pete. What actually happened was, when they went to do their audition down at Parlophone on the 6th of June 1962, George Martin decided he would use a session drummer when they came to make a record, if they were going to make a record. Now that was quite standard practice back then, it was not unusual. So George Martin told Brian Epstein and said, look, don't mind about the group, but when we come to make the first record, if I'm going to give you a contract, I'm going to use a session drummer. But of course Brian didn't know what that meant. He didn't know that was standard practice, and of course nor did the Beatles. So when Brian tells John, Paul and George, look, George Martin doesn't think Pete's good enough to play on the record, they thought, oh no, what are we going to do? And as Paul McCartney said, Pete was a great drummer, he worked so well when they were playing live, but if the producer doesn't think he's good enough, and this is our last chance of getting a recording contract, they had to change the drummer. So they took that decision and they decided they were going to replace him. Now, even though Ringo had sat in with them 2 or 3 times when Pete couldn't play, and Ringo was a good friend of George, they approached 3 other drummers as well. So they approached a guy called Bobby Graham. Now, he was a fantastic drummer, top session drummer, live drummer, was playing with Joe Brown and the Brothers on a national tour. Of course, Bobby Graham turned them down. He wasn't going to leave London and this amazing career for a group he'd never heard of, who'd only just got a recording contract. So he turned them down. Another drummer called Richie Galvin was approached. He was the drummer with Earl Preston and the TTs. Again, top drummer. But he just got married, he had his job, he didn't want to give that up. And as with a lot of Liverpool musicians, didn't really get on with John. So he turned him down. Then on one Saturday evening, Ringo had been invited down to the Odd Spot Club in Bold Street by George Harrison. After the gig, John, Paul and George took Ringo over to see Brian and introduced him. And they decided they wanted Ringo for the job. So Brian said, I'll give you a call on Tuesday to confirm it. And so he did. On the Tuesday, Brian rings Ringo and says, yeah, you got the job. Can you play tomorrow night? He said, well, no. I'm at Butlins playing with Rory Stone and the Hurricanes, but I can come back on Saturday. So they agreed to that. The following day, Brian brings Pete into his office and gives him the bad news. And this is where I found out what really happened, because I interviewed a guy called David Harris, who was Brian Epstein's lawyer. And he said the big problem they had was Pete Best could not be sacked. Now, legally, he couldn't, because the Beatles were a partnership and you can't sack a partner. So Pete Best was never sacked, he was never dismissed. They had to find a way of convincing Pete he was being sacked to get him to quit the band. And that's what they did. So in that office, Brian said to him, I don't know how to tell you this, Pete, but the boys want you out, i.e. your other partners want to get rid of you, and Ringo's joining on Saturday. At no point did Brian tell him that he was sacked. But Brian legally still had to find work for Pete to do. But he offered him the job with the Merseybeats, who at that time, the lads were 16 and 15, hadn't really started. Pete was never going to accept that. So Brian's friend Joe Flannery invites Pete to join a new band that he was putting together, Lee Curtis and the All-Stars. And so Pete agreed and joined Lee Curtis and the All-Stars. By doing that, legally, effectively, Pete quits the Beatles. So it was all a bit messy, and it's all been shrouded in mystery and myth since 1962. So it wasn't the greatest thing the Beatles ever did. So when I was writing this book, Finding the Fourth Beatle, I was looking at it and thinking, hang on, we've got two different bands here. We've got a band called the Beatles, who were John, Paul, George and Pete, who were like the fantastic rock and roll band. But what they had to become was a completely new band, and that was a pop group called the Fab Four, which was John, Paul, George and Ringo. So if you see it like the end of one rock and roll band and the creation of a brand new pop group, then you can appreciate Pete for what he'd done with that band. But then we look at this other group called the Fab Four and look at what they did. For the pop group and for what they were about to become a recording band, they couldn't have chosen anybody better than Ringo Starr. Ringo was innovative, and there's so many drummers, even to today, who look back and say, Ringo's the guy who changed it all. He had a way of feeling the mood for the song and playing the appropriate rhythm. And if he didn't know it, he'd create one. And if you go and listen to some of those Beatles recordings and just listen for the drumming, some of it's absolutely phenomenal. Go and listen to things like Ticket to Ride, Come Together. Even Strawberry Fields Forever, his drumming on that's fantastic. And one of the least known but greatest Beatles songs, which is Rain. Or things from like Tomorrow Never Knows. Ringo became the great drummer. And that's why we called the book Finding the Fourth Beatle. Because we had John, Paul and George. And their search was to find the permanent guy, the drummer, who would stay with them. And that was Ringo. So that's how it all happened. So Pete Best, he was a great drummer for what the Beatles were doing at the time. But they were about to become a brand new group. And Ringo was the perfect drummer. He was the perfect fourth Beatle.